there are more similarities than there are differences in terms of the kinds of things that men and women tend to fantasize about. So most of the things that men are fantasizing about, women fantasize about as well, and vice versa. But on average, there are some differences. So
this is the Man Up Podcast, a doctor's guide to men's health.
If you've been enjoying listening to our podcast, please hit the subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts.
My name is Dr. Kevin Chu, and I'm joined as always with my co-host, Dr. Justin Dubin. This week, our episode is titled, Let's Talk About Sex, Friends with Benefits, Condom Use, and Fantasy. Justin, this was a very, very great conversation.
Oh, really fun. I think we both got the answers to some questions that we've wanted for a while. We really highlighted interesting things like fetishes, what guys really, or at least imagine that they're into and then claim that they do, even though we really don't think that they're actually maybe doing it as much as they say they are.
Right.
I got my answer of foot fetishes answered. So if you're trying to figure out what's up with foot fetishes, you might have your answer. What did you like to, what was the topic?
I like to talk about the friends with benefits. You know, we see it so much in pop culture, like friends with benefit. It works. It doesn't work. I don't know. We talk about in the episode, you get the answer according to data, according to science.
Yeah. And if you're interested in trying to, give your partner the best pleasure, we also talk about best sex positions, which is also obviously very, very interesting. And obviously when you hear the answer, I think it makes a lot of sense. And we talk about that a little bit in depth. But I think it's a great episode. Dr. Lehmiller, he is honestly a fantastic guest. He received his PhD in social psychology from Purdue University. He's a research fellow at Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Dr. Lehmiller is an award-winning educator, having been honored 3 times with the Certificate of Teaching Excellence from Harvard University. Maybe you heard of it, where he taught for several years. He's also a prolific researcher, as you're going to hear, and scholar who has published more than 50 academic works to date, including a textbook book titled The Psychology of Human Sexuality that is used in college classrooms around the world. He also has his own podcast. We do recommend you go check that out. Really excellent guest. There's so many things we didn't touch on. I am 100,000% sure that we'll have him on. He is a encyclopedia of sex knowledge. I thought this guy really, he knows sex.
Yeah, we only know a small fraction compared to him.
Oh yeah, not even close.
Yeah.
So that's, but very, very interesting conversation. I think everyone's going to like it. Want to get into it?
Let's go. All right. So we are joined today by Dr. Justin Lehmiller, and we're going to talk about all things sex. Friends with benefits, condom use, fantasy. This is going to be a great, great episode. I'm going to learn a lot because there's a lot of questions that I've been wanting to ask, and I've been waiting for this episode. So first off, Dr. Lehmiller, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me here. Always happy to have an excuse to talk about sex.
I feel like most dudes do.
Well, let's just jump right straight into it, all right? So, Dr. Lehmiller, first question I have for you. One of your focuses is on sexual fantasies. So what are the most common sexual fantasies that men have?
So I've been studying sexual fantasies for a number of years. I actually wrote a whole book on the subject called Tell Me What You Want that was based on a survey of more than 4,000 American adults. I asked them hundreds of questions about their sexual fantasies, including about their favorite fantasy of all time. And I did look at whether there were any gender differences that emerged in the types of fantasies that people had. And I always like to start by saying that there are more similarities than there are differences in terms of the kinds of things that men and women tend to fantasize about. So most of the things that men are fantasizing about, women fantasize about as well, and vice versa. But on average, there are some differences. So one of the big differences is that on average, men tend to have a lot more fantasies about sex with multiple partners. So threesomes, orgies, 4Gs, you name it, anything with more than 2, men have more fantasies about it. The same is true for non-monogamy fantasies. So men are much more likely to fantasize about committing infidelity or about being in some type of sexually open relationship, such as maybe swinging or cuckolding, which is where they're watching their partner have sex with someone else. And then one of the other big differences between men and women is that men have a lot more fantasies about things that are taboo, things that you're not supposed to do sexually according to your culture, society, or religion. And I think the taboo thing is actually one of the reasons why I found that men actually feel more shame and guilt and embarrassment about their fantasies than women do, which was something that, kind of surprised me, because we hear a lot about the sexual double standard and how women are judged more harshly than men for their sexual interests and behaviors. And so on the basis of that, you might think that women would feel more shame about their fantasies, but it wasn't the case. It was actually that men felt the most shame and guilt. And I think in part that's because men fantasize about more taboo things than women do.
That's fascinating. Now, just as a follow-up question to that, I think when you're with a group of guys, guys talking with guys, they often talk about those kinds of fantasies. So that's kind of interesting to me that they're more ashamed, obviously, for the more taboo ones. But I was going to ask you later, but I mean, when we're talking about taboo things, I just want to understand, I don't know if you looked at foot fetish or anything like that. And that's obviously fetishism and fantasy is a little bit different. Maybe you can highlight the difference, but is there a reason why guys are into feet and women are not? And that's something that I've always thought about, because I'd love to sell my feet if I could make some money off of it.
Right? It sounds like a pretty nice little income stream on the side. But yes, so I did ask about fetish related fantasies, including foot fantasies, and that did fall into the taboo category. Most of the things that are considered to be either deviant or unusual or uncommon tend to fall in that category of taboos. So in terms of foot fetishes, I found that about 1 in 7 people had a fantasy that involved feet or toes in some prominent role. So it's actually not quite as uncommon as people might think that it is for people to eroticize feet. But yes, on average, men fantasize about feet and have foot fetishes far more often than women do. In terms of reasons for that, it's always hard to say exactly what the cause or reason might be. One possibility is that, there might be a sociocultural explanation here. So if you think, for example, about how feet tend to be depicted in the media and differences in how women's feet and men's feet are shown, there's a big difference there, right? So women's feet are often shown in this sexy way in advertising and movies and media. If you think about, for example, the Barbie movie and the way that women's feet were depicted there and how they were eroticized, you don't really have something parallel like that for men's feet where they're shown in that sexy fashion. Instead, when men's feet are talked about, they're talked about as being kind of gross and disgusting. So, part of it might be kind of like a cultural conditioning factor. Another part of it might be that just men in general seem to be more likely to develop fixations or fetishes for specific objects or body parts. It's often argued that women's sexuality is much more flexible than men's, whereas men's is much more fixed. And so if you think about sexuality as kind of having an imprinting period where in earlier stages of development, if something comes to be a focus of your attraction, for men it seems to get fixed more often than it does for women, where it's more fluid or flexible throughout the lifespan. So those are a couple of ideas. Again, we don't know for sure, but there's some possibilities.
Oh, I get that. Guys are simple. I see something that interests me, I'm fixated on it. Probably anything else that's going on,
100%.
doesn't matter. I'm fixated on it. But feet, not for me. Just good.
Not my thing either. No hate. You got
no
feet.
hate.
You're interested in it. God bless.
But it's an interesting point that you talk, because Justin, you brought up Justin Dubin. You brought up, that guys do talk about some of their fantasies, but it's generally the first one that you touched upon, right? It's like, oh yeah, I'm going to try to get with those 3 girls, or have a threesome. It's more that. Definitely, yeah. I think the taboo stuff we definitely don't talk much about at all. But so now you highlighted a lot for men, and you said there's a lot of overlap. But is there any particular sexual fantasies for women that are more common?
Yeah, there are a few things that women fantasize about more than men. So, one example would be on average, women have more fantasies about passion, romance, and emotional fulfillment than men do. That's not to say that men don't have these fantasies. Most men do. It's just on average, women have them more often. And one of the most common ones is the fantasy about wanting to be wanted or wanting to be desired by your partner. Another fantasy that women have more often than men is that if we look in a heterosexual context, women's fantasies are more likely to contain elements of same-sex attraction than men's are. So I find that if I look in my data, people who identify as exclusively heterosexual, more than half of women say that they've had a fantasy about sexual activity with another woman before. For men, the number is around 25% or so, which is actually still high. 1 in 4 guys who identify as exclusively straight say they've had a fantasy involving another man before. But women, on average, have them much more often than men do. The other big area where there was a difference was that women have more kink and BDSM fantasies than men do. So this was something that was kind of surprising to me. It was across the board. It didn't matter what facet or element of BDSM I looked at. Women were fantasizing about that at a higher rate than men were. So women's fantasies, while they're more likely to have those passion and romance elements, they're also more likely to have those kink elements than men are. Versus, as we talked about earlier, men are more likely to have multiple partners in their fantasies.
That's really interesting because I think there's some ironic thing going on here where you're talking about men who are fantasizing about three-ways, foursomes, and yet they're not as interested in the aspect of being with another person of their same gender, and yet the women, although they are less likely to have those fantasies, often incorporate them more. And I guess this is a natural follow-up to the question then is like, what percentage of people are acting on these fantasies? And, if you are someone who's interested in acting in your fantasy, how do you approach that with a partner in a safe and approachable way? Because obviously there's clear overlap here and maybe people are not communicating. And that's one of the biggest problems we have with sex. We're not communicating our thoughts, our desires. Same thing in relationships in general.
Yeah. And one thing to add on to what I was saying previously before I get into those questions is that when men fantasize about other men, and specifically when I'm talking about heterosexual men, it's usually only in the context of sex with another woman at the same time as well. So it's safer to kind of explore a fantasy with another man if there's a woman present, I think, because it seems less gay to some guys to do it in that way. So I think for a lot of men who have kind of bisexual tendencies, they'll often express them in their fantasies through, having sex with a man and a woman at the same time, not with just a man alone, because, there's something about that sort of, I think there's masculinity threat or sexual identity threat in some ways that might emerge for some guys. But anyway, regarding your question about how many people have ever shared or acted on their fantasies, I find that this is consistent across multiple studies I've done. About half of people say that they've shared their favorite fantasy with a partner before, and about between a quarter and a fifth of people, between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 people, say that they've acted on their favorite fantasy before. Now, interestingly, about 80% of people say that they want to act on their favorite fantasy, right? So most people want to employ that in their sex life at some point, but surprisingly few people have ever done it. So there's a really big gap between fantasy and reality. And I think it's hard for a lot of folks because, you have this scenario that you've mapped out in your head that is very arousing and hot to you, but how do you actually translate that into action?
Right.
So first, you got to think about all the steps here. Like first you have to actually communicate about that with a partner. Then your partner has to be on board. And if that fantasy involves multiple other people at the same time, you've got to get a ton of other people on board.
Some coordination.
Exactly. So the coordination just to kind of make it happen in the first place is often a big stumbling block. But when I ask people, what are the specific reasons why you haven't acted on your fantasies before, I find that there are really two things that stand out. the first is that they just don't know how to go about doing it. Like, it's a lack of knowledge. Like, I don't even know where to begin. So for example, if you think about something like a threesome fantasy, it's like, how do you make that happen? A lot of people think like it's hard enough to find just one person to have sex with, let alone multiple people at the same time in the same bed. Like, so how does it happen? So lack of knowledge is a big thing. And then there's also a lot of fear and uncertainty about like, what would happen if I actually did this? Would it be as good as the scenario that I have in my head? Is it going to change the way that my partner sees me? Could it lead to conflict if there's a relationship involved there? And what if other people found out that like I have this interest that maybe is taboo or kinky or something like that? So the fear and uncertainty are really the big things that hold people back.
I'd have to say, though, I think the internet has really unlocked a lot of opportunity for people because, let's think about before the internet. Like, you just kind of have to be kind of like in a social circle and then just kind of like hint like, oh, yeah, oh yeah, maybe this, like very, very subtly. But now on the internet, you can put a post on Craigslist like, hey, I'm looking exactly for this. Anyone a partner or anyone interested? So I think the internet has really unlocked a lot of it for good, I think, because, getting the fantasies that you want should be something that should be allowable for us.
And there's something to be said for online communication about your fantasies and desires, because people often find it easier to type things than to actually say things and put them in words. And also, if you can add a layer of, anonymity where you can kind of put this out there and you can wait to see if somebody's interested before you identify yourself, that can make it feel a little bit safer to do it. So there's absolutely a lot to be said for the role of technology in facilitating finding partners who are like-minded, but also just in terms of expressing your sexual desires. And one other thing I'll say, I think, you're curious about, well, how do you communicate with a partner? How do you tell them that you have a fantasy? I love to suggest technology as a way to do this, right? So there are actually a couple of apps that you can use where if you have a partner, you can kind of hone in on your shared sexual interests. I don't have a financial stake in these apps. I wish I did, because I recommend them like all the time. But one of them is called X Confessions, and the other one is called Own Your Sex. And both of them are basically like Tinder for sexual fantasies, where you and your partner each download the app, you sync your accounts, and then you take this quiz of different sexual fantasies, and you basically swipe right if you're into it and left if you aren't. And then the app will compile your shared interests and then only share the ones with you that you and your partner have in common. And then that way you don't have to worry about putting something out there that your partner isn't into. And so it's a way of sort of quickly and easily like cutting through, all the anxiety and worry, and just saying like, okay, here are the things that we're a match on and things that we might potentially want to explore together.
That's a brilliant app. Absolutely. Brilliant.
I know. I wish I would have thought of it.
Oh man, what an app! Shout out to the people who created that. I mean, that's pretty badass. All right, so let's move on to the next topic. Thank you for highlighting fantasy. Obviously, we could talk about fantasy forever.
Oh, forever.
But I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could spend years and years on it. So, but I really wanted to go to another interesting topic that you've really studied, and one of the first people to look at was friends with benefits. I feel like whenever you know someone with friends with benefits, it either ends one or two ways, right? They either become in a serious relationship or they cut off all relations altogether for the most part. So for people who are friends with benefits, how long on average do these relationships last? Typically, what becomes of these relationships in the data that you've studied?
Yeah, so the reason I got into studying friends with benefits was actually because I had so many questions from undergraduate students I was teaching in human sexuality courses who are like, how do you make friends with benefits work? And I always like to give people answers that are based on empirical evidence, data. I don't like to just speak off the top of my head and give random opinions. I want to be able to have data or evidence to back this up. And so that kind of led me to say, all right, we don't know the answer to this, so we got to collect the data ourselves. And I ended up spending more than a decade studying friends with benefits and publishing multiple papers on that subject. And I think it's so interesting because if you look at popular media portrayals of friends with benefits, they're exactly like what you're saying. You know, they always seem to get awkward and complicated, or they end up falling in love. And it's like, there's no kind of middle ground where you just kind of have the friends with benefits. So what we did in our research in one of the studies was we did this 1-year longitudinal study of friends with benefits to see what happens over the course of a year for somebody who has a friend with benefits. And what we found was that most of those relationships either dissolved or changed form within the span of a year, which would suggest that these relationships typically don't stay friends with benefits for a super long period of time. And in terms of the outcomes, it was super mixed. It wasn't like there was just one thing that happened, because we saw that, you know, there was a segment of these relationships, you know, roughly a quarter who ended up becoming romantic partners, and then another quarter who were still friends with benefits over that period of time. Then another quarter who went back to being just friends, and then another quarter who became frenemies, and, you know, they hate each other and no longer talk anymore. So it's like, it's not like you can say there's just one thing that happens. It goes off in all these different directions.
Very, very interesting. Now, you know, for people who are interested in having friends with benefits, you know, is there anything you can recommend to these people to make it work?
Yes. And so that's one of the other things we looked at in the research was what predicts having a successful outcome in a friends with benefits relationship. Now, a successful outcome really depends on like what are the goals of the partners, and that's another thing we looked at in the research is like, what do you want out of this relationship? Is it just an opportunity for no string sex? Is it because you're actually looking for a relationship? Is this like a temporary thing while you're waiting for a relationship to happen with someone else? Like, so, you know, relationship success is always subjective. It's in the eyes of the beholder. But we kind of define success as, you know, you're not frenemies at the end, right? So you still have a relationship with this person on some form. And the factors that predict maintaining some type of relationship with the other person were, first, establishing very clear ground rules at the beginning. So saying what this relationship is and is not. Also communicating about what your expectations were for the relationship. So is this something that you want to be just sex, or are you open to the possibility of more? And then, you know, establishing like the boundaries and defining, you know, the clear ground rules for the relationship. So are you allowed to sleep over or not? Like, what are the specific rules of this situation? Essentially, it all boils down to communication. So the more you communicate about your expectations and your boundaries, the less likely it is that it's going to get awkward and that somebody's going to get hurt. Now, I should say that communication is not a guarantee of a great outcome, because sometimes people lie. We know that they do that. And, you know, if there's somebody that you like really want to have a sexual relationship with, or let's say you really want to have a romantic relationship with somebody else, but it seems like a friends with benefits is the only thing that you can make happen. Now you might lie and say friends with benefits is what you really want, when what you actually want is that romantic relationship, right? So that's, you know, where these relationships sometimes get tricky, is that people aren't always honest about their intentions going in. So, you know, communication is your best friend here, but just recognize people aren't always honest about their intentions.
As a follow-up to that, you know, Kevin alluded to the internet being helpful in that way as well. I mean, what about dating apps? Have dating apps made that better or worse in terms of identifying, you know, you're on the apps, you see what they're interested in an open relationship, you know, a serious relationship, long-term relationship. Do you feel that, you know, identifying someone who is going to be in the same style relationship, or at least be on the same page as you, is easier now with apps than it has been in the past?
I mean, I'd like to say yes, but if you ask people who are using these apps, you know, how's it going for you? They're going to describe it as a hellscape of, you know, like all these people who are flakes or are rejecting them, or they just can't find a match. And so, you know, online dating is one of those things where it's a very mixed bag, where for some people it results in really great outcomes. They get exactly what they're looking for. They develop a relationship or multiple relationships. Whereas for others, it's just like one string of rejections after the other. And it doesn't matter what app they use or what words they say or how much effort they put into their profile or, how many filters they use on their photos, like they still can't find a match. Like that's the reality of it. I think online dating works well for a small segment of the population, and in particular, a segment that tends to be more conventionally attractive, because in online dating, people tend to make very quick snap judgments based on limited information, often based only on the picture. They'll often decide based on somebody's appearance whether they even want to read what they've written in their profile. And so that's where, I think it's a tough world for a lot of folks, because how do you stand out when it seems like, everybody else is super hot and attractive and people are only making judgments based on photos? So yeah, it's a tricky thing. I think it's been helpful and it's been harmful at the same time.
All right, very good. So let's switch gears. We're going to switch to another topic, and we're going to talk about three ways. So three ways, as we kind of talked a little bit about earlier, are something that you see frequently referenced in pop culture. You see them in movies, in television, and quite frequently in porn. But Dr. Lehmiller, realistically, how many people are actually having threesomes?
Probably not as many as you think, right?
No way, dude.
I thought I was just missing out the whole time.
So I found in my research that having a threesome was actually the single most popular sexual fantasy. I mean, more than 1/3 of American adults in my data described their favorite fantasy as involving a threesome in some way. And if you look at how many people have ever fantasized about a threesome, you're talking about like 80-90%. Like it's a near universal fantasy. In terms of how many people have actually done it, if you look at data from nationally representative surveys, there's actually interestingly a pretty big gender difference where it's, somewhere around 1 in 10 women and 1 in 5 men who say that they've had a threesome. And I don't know, that number might sound high to some people. It might sound low
like guys
to
are
others.
lying. Sounds like guys are lying, dude.
But yeah, it's interesting. Like, why is there that big gender difference? And also, if you look at data on, how many sexual partners do people say that they've had, you find that men on average are reporting about twice as many partners as women are. And it's like, who are they having sex with, right? Because most of them are heterosexual. And so, the math, it just doesn't quite add up.
Nothing.
Yeah, so there's actually been some research looking into, well, what accounts for these kinds of discrepancies? And, part of it is that men sometimes overstate their sexual history to try and look good, whereas women sometimes understate theirs, out of sexual modesty. But there's more to it than that. So if you're asking about something like previous number of sex partners, like men are more likely to kind of ballpark the number and like guesstimate that, versus women are more likely to go back and actually do the math, right? And so it turns out those things tend to result in different numbers. But anyway, so yeah, that's a little bit about, how many people have actually had a threesome, but there's also variability based on gender. Well, I already talked about gender. There's also variability based on sexual orientation and age. So, people often think of threesomes as something that like young adults, college kids are doing. And actually, if you look at experiences with threesomes, college students are the least experienced group with this activity. It's actually people in their 30s, 40s, 50s who are going to be the most experienced and practiced with threesomes. And I think that's for a few reasons. One is that like when you're younger, sex with just one other person is kind of like novel and exciting and fun, versus once you've had a bit more sex, it's like, all right, how do we make this interesting again, right? Especially if you're in a long-term monogamous relationship. And I think one of the reasons people often gravitate towards threesomes is because that's the easiest way to introduce novelty, is like, let's bring in another person into this context. I also find in my fantasy research that interest in threesomes in terms of fantasy content peaks in your 40s. So, there's actually like this interesting time course to our fantasies where with threesomes, they're lowest lowest when you're in your 20s, and then they increase steadily through your 40s and 50s, and then they start to decline again, right? So it's actually going to be people in midlife who are having the most threesomes. And then there's also a sexual orientation difference where LGBTQ people have a heck of a lot more threesomes than heterosexual folks do. And bisexual people in particular have the most, perhaps because they have the most options in terms of combinations of partners.
You know, I there's so much to take in there and comment about. But the first thing I want to comment about is like, you know, I don't know, I guess it's not the misrepresentation of numbers and sexual partners, but that immediately took me back to the movie American Pie 2, where when they're coming back, or maybe it was 3, when they're coming back to the lake house and they're re-meeting and they're like, how many people should I say I had sex with? And it was the rule of 3, right? Yeah. Like for a guy, you have to multiply it by 3. A girl, you have to divide by 3 to be more modest. So that's the first thing. I just find this so interesting because, I mean, just from my patient population, from the age thing, I can tell you most of the guys that I see who are having, you know, multiple partners at one time, they're in their 50s or 60s and you know, they're mostly heterosexual, but they're coming in like telling me that they need erectile dysfunction meds because they need to last a little bit longer because they're pleasuring multiple partners at a time. So, you know, it checks out, and I've been thinking about this for a while, and it's very cool to see the data behind it. I don't know, Kevin, what were you going to say?
No, I was just going to shout out my wife as we are, you know, close to getting to our 40s, you know. Hey. That's all I was going to say.
You know, in my data, the peak, like in terms of interest in threesomes, is similar for men and women, where it increases in their 40s. So, you know, actually, that's the age range at which men and women are the least different in terms of their interest in multi-partner sex fantasies and non-monogamy. So, hey, you know, maybe there's an opportunity.
Well, also, you know, you just blew up your wife's spot. She's 21, by the way. She just turned. Right. Congratulations on turning 21 again. She's very young, you know, so that is a brutal spot to put yourself in. No shot for 3-ways now. But
nope, sorry. You're screwed, not in the good way.
Just one final question about 3-ways. You know, are the people who are having 3-ways actually in a relationship with one of the partners, or are these non-monogamous relationships? Like, is it people all seeking this fantasy together, or is it someone coming into a relationship that's already established?
It's a really mixed bag. I would say, you know, one of the differences is that, you know, among heterosexual people, it's most likely to occur within the context of an existing relationship between a man and a woman where they bring in another partner. More often than not, you know, in that context, it tends to be a female partner who's brought in because men tend to be more open to the idea of a female-female-male versus male-male-female threesome, right? But if you look at LGBTQ folks, they're more likely to have had threesomes where it's like just 3 friends who like get together and decide to have sex, right? That doesn't happen as often in that kind of heterosexual context, in part because the gender dynamics can create this limitation on, you know, sort of who can get together with whom and like what might be considered to be acceptable or open. For LGBTQ people, they tend to be more open about discussing sex and fantasy and turn-ons and pleasure, and so it just creates more opportunities for them. So sorry, straight people, you know, it's a little harder for you to have a threesome.
All right, so that was an excellent discussion on threesome. So we're gonna switch gears now. Dr. Lehmiller, you've done some excellent research on condom usage. So, you know, I think one of the most common complaints about condoms is that men say condom usage reduces sexual pleasure. So is this true, and do condoms actually reduce sexual satisfaction?
So, you know, that's a tricky thing, right? So when it comes to how do condoms impact pleasure, like there are some data out there, there's some studies showing that condoms don't impact pleasure. And frankly, I take them with a little bit of a grain of salt because I've used condoms and I know that they impact your sensation and pleasure, right?
Absolutely.
Just doesn't feel the same. And I know that there are differences in condoms, like in terms of like their size, in terms of their thickness. And so, from my own personal experience, I would say that before you give up on condoms or say that they ruin sex or take away from your pleasure, you need to experiment with a heck of a lot of different ones because they all fit differently. They all feel different. And there are things you can do to try and increase the pleasurability of condoms, such as putting a drop or two of lube inside the condom before you put it on to give it a little bit more slipperiness and feel. So yeah, it's one of those things where I'd love to say that condoms don't have any impact on pleasure or sensation, but the reality is that for a lot of guys they do. And part of this also goes to differences in general penile sensitivity, right? So some guys just have penises that are way more sensitive than other guys do. Like, it does not take much stimulation for them to have an orgasm, whereas for other guys, it's just like it takes a lot more to get there, right? So some guys have premature ejaculation, some guys have delayed ejaculation, and everybody else is kind of like somewhere in the middle on a spectrum. And so just because of the fact that penises are not interchangeable and they're all different in terms of their sensation and sensitivity, condoms are going to differentially impact certain people. So if you're somebody who has delayed ejaculation and then you're adding a condom into that situation, that's just going to delay it further, right? And make it even more difficult to have an orgasm, versus if you're somebody who has premature ejaculation, using a condom might actually be desirable from the standpoint that it can reduce sensation to some degree and help you to last longer in bed, right? Which is why wearing a condom is often recommended to guys who have PE, because it's a proven way of lasting longer in bed, right? So yeah, it's one of those things where condoms affect different people in different ways. They're one of the greatest sexual health tools that we have, but they're an area that is really ripe for reinvention. The condoms that we're using today are not that different from the condoms that we were using 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. We really haven't had enough innovations in the condom space to make them more pleasurable.
I mean, it's a great point. I think that Kevin and I know that we often recommend condoms, exactly like you said, for men with premature ejaculation, because it does, for many people, affect, how it feels. And it does often work. Well, now it doesn't work for everyone. And, some people have no issues. I agree. I mean, it seems that satisfaction is less. And for many people. And, Kevin and I don't know when this is going to air, but we are going to be having on an episode with that's going to be exploring male contraception and new options for male contraception with a specialist in that. And I'm excited to hear what's down the pipeline. But the difference, though, is really condoms, unlike most other forms of contraception, are protecting against STIs, STDs as well. So, like vasectomy, all these other things, oral birth control, they're preventing birth and a child being born. They're not preventing STDs and STIs. So, that is one of the biggest benefits that condoms really do have. But I guess my next question really is, do we know who's using them? Like, what factors influence condom usage in a situation? Because I think that there's a lot of times where there's a discrepancy between partners, whether, the guy wants to wear it, the girl doesn't want you to wear it, or vice versa, or depending on what kind of relationship you are in. So what are some factors that influence condom usage? Because, Kevin and I, and it sounds like Justin, you also, we are all very big fans of protecting yourself, using condoms, and we're always promoting condom usage in monogamous relationships if needed, as well as non-monogamous relationships.
Yeah, so I am a big advocate for condoms and safer sex in general, and you should do what you can to maintain and protect your sexual health and the health of your partners. There are so many things that you can do beyond just condoms. We could have a whole other discussion about the HPV vaccine and about PrEP and about like all of these other great safe sex tools that are out there. But condoms are really the go-to tool for most people. But as you point out, yeah, sometimes there are disagreements about whether or not to use a condom. And oftentimes it goes back to that point that we were just talking about, where condoms can interfere with the sensation and pleasure for some people. And so that's why some people choose to forego condoms when they would otherwise benefit from them. But it's not just that. I mean, when it comes to condoms, there's also the issue of availability. Like, do you even have a condom around? Like, so let's say you and your partner are like really in the mood and you want to have sex, but you don't have a condom. Sometimes people will decide to do it anyway because they're in the heat of the moment. And what we know from the research is that being in a sexually aroused state impairs people's sexual decision making. Like, they make riskier decisions in general. So there's a super fascinating study that my colleague Shayna Sparling conducted, where she basically brought participants into the lab and she had them watch porn, and then they were either given a hypothetical scenario where they would decide whether or not they would have sex with someone with or without a condom, or in the other scenario they were actually playing a game of blackjack to see like what kind of moves they would make in gambling. And what they found was that people opted for the riskier decision, the riskier move in blackjack, and the riskier sexual health decision when they had just watched porn beforehand, right? So
that's
sexual
awesome.
arousal, it just impairs our decision making, which is I think why a lot of casinos employ very sexy waitresses and dealers, right? Because they kind of want to get you aroused and in the mood. And then they also feed you alcohol at the same time, right? So it's like a perfect storm of like, how do we get people to make bad decisions? But, we could do a whole podcast on like the psychology of casinos and how they manipulate us.
That'd be great.
I would love that. But it makes sense, right? Like you have fight or flight, right? Like you're kind of just not necessarily fight or flight, you're rest digest, but there's a component of fight or flight to get the erection and stimulation. And, your brain's kind of shutting off that aspect of critical thinking in many ways in order to get to the point.
You're fixated on one
there
thing
you go.
Want,
Kevin's
right?
Clearly got some fixations in the back of his mind. But yeah, that's so interesting, and it makes sense. I think we've all been, and there is a component, like you said, you're in the moment, and saying like, hey, let's stop, I need to put a condom on, can be a mood killer. It can, but of course you have to think about your health, not just the moment that you're in and your partner's health.
And then there's the whole act of like opening the condom, and we've all seen like in the media and movies and so forth, like people struggling to get it open and like trying to open it with their teeth and getting scissors and like all these other kinds of things. Like that's where some people also forego it, is because it is something that is disruptive, because I don't know, for some reason those packages are not as easy to open as they should be.
They should be easier. Yeah.
Are guys still walking around like with a condom at all times? Like, dude, I've been married for a while, but like back in college, you're walking around with one all the time. Are they? I don't know.
I don't know the answer to that, but I know that at least
Justin?
in the past, I think it was often a status symbol. Like if you're walking around with a condom, it meant you were sexually active.
Right.
If you had one in your wallet and you could kind of like see the outline of it through the wallet.
Exactly.
Like, you knew
That
he was
condom
having
has
sex.
like a million holes in it, by the way. Like that thing was rubbed out. That condom has been in there for 3 years, never been used. I feel like the guy who keeps the condom in there is a guy who's never used it. I'm just,
And you probably don't want to use that condom, right? Because it's like been exposed to your body heat, and it's been like sitting in the hot car and like all these other things. Like that is exspired as fuck. Like don't use that.
100%. It's so bad. It's so true. It's but whatever. Everyone has to live their truth. Just be careful. Like check the expiration on the condom. I would say at least, that's something you could do. Kevin, you want to get this last question out?
Oh yeah, for sure. So, all right. So, saw you posted a study the other day that reviewed sexual positions and which provided women in heterosexual relationships with the most consistent orgasms. So the question is, and Justin and I are really yearning to know, what is the best sex position to make your partner orgasm?
Okay, so in a heterosexual context, there are actually three positions that I can recommend where research has shown that they are linked to greater female orgasm consistency. Before I get into that, let me first mention that the single most commonly used sexual position among straight men and women is the missionary position, man on top. And that's actually not one of the positions that is linked to women having the most consistent orgasms. Right? So you might need to, yeah, you might need to mix it up a little bit. So, okay, in terms of positions to try, the let me make sure I get this right. Okay. So in terms of positions to try, the seated face-to-face position with the woman on top is one of those positions that is linked to greater female orgasm consistency. And the same is true for the cowgirl position, right? And both of these, I think, are kind of similar in the sense that in those positions, the clitoris is coming into constant contact with her partner's body, and so it's receiving more friction, more stimulation, and so it makes sense that it's going to be linked to greater orgasm consistency, because we know from mountains of data and reports from women that clitoral stimulation is key to having an orgasm for most women. The other position that I can recommend is, it doesn't have a sexy name. It's called the coital alignment technique, or CAT position for short, if you use the acronym. But basically that is a modified missionary position where basically the guy will kind of lean up further during it so that the base of his penis is in contact with her clitoris, and then the partners will just kind of rock back and forth. So rather than being a thrusting motion, it's kind of this coordinated body movement where you're just kind of gently rocking back and forth. And that position has been scientifically linked to greater female orgasm consistency and also greater odds of simultaneous orgasm. So essentially, positions that maximize natural clitoral stimulation by creating more friction during the act are the ones that women tend to experience the most orgasms from without having to add additional clitoral stimulation. So, I should also say as a caveat that with some other sexual positions, it's not to say that they can't work or that women can't orgasm in them. It's just that oftentimes you kind of need that assist of providing additional clitoral stimulation, whether through fingers or through a sex toy, in order to create the stimulation that's necessary for the female orgasm to happen.
That makes so much sense. I mean, all of that stuff that you said. The cat is interesting. So, yeah, I can definitely picture in my head the way that you described it, and it makes sense. It's a lot of rubbing and not the penetration that's really doing it. And as we've all known, like, penetration is really a small part of orgasm for women, and a much bigger part, and stimulation for men. But yeah, that is really, really interesting. And just to highlight to our listeners, what percentage of women achieve orgasm through penetrative sex alone?
Well, that's a number that varies a bit across studies. And, what the data show is that for most women, in order to have an orgasm during partnered sex and to do so consistently, they're gonna need clitoral stimulation. So I'm not recalling like the exact number off the top of my head because different studies have pointed to different things. Some studies find that a majority of women don't experience orgasm through vaginal penetration alone. It's not surprising when you consider the important role of clitoral stimulation. So yeah, it's something where the activities, the things that people tend to do the most often during partnered sex are not necessarily the things that bring women the most pleasure. And that's where you need to be open to modifying, adapting, and being a little bit flexible in terms of how you pursue pleasure.
I think that, the theme really for almost everything we've talked about, whether it's fantasies, friends with benefits, having a threesome, pleasuring your partner in the way that you want and the way that they want, is about communication. And that's one of the worst things that men do. Hands down, consistently, we are not good communicators. When it comes to these things, you said it yourself in the beginning, guys don't want to talk about some of these taboo things. Kevin and I know that men don't want to talk about their health. They don't want to talk about their penis health. They don't want to talk about their fertility. And which is one of the main reasons why we do this podcast, because it's a safe space. And Justin, that's one of the reasons why you do your excellent podcast as well. And I guess my real comment or question is, do you have any final comments to our listeners about communicating and making a clear message as a man, whether your partner is another man, whether a partner is another female, whether you're having multiple partners, what are your thoughts on communication and sexual pleasure?
It's so important. And, one of the things that really surprised me about some of the research that I've done is that men are actually more likely than women to consult a healthcare professional for a sexual problem. But when it comes to a general healthcare problem, women are much more likely to consult a healthcare provider, right? Men do not want to go to the doctor for their regular routine health or annual exams or physicals or things like that. But when they have a problem with their penis, they're more likely to go to a doctor. But it's often because they're looking for the easy solution. They want the pill, they want the Viagra, something that is going to make it easier to allow them to have an erection or to perform on demand. And, while those drugs can work, they don't fix the underlying problem in a lot of cases, which is that there's a communication issue, right? You can take as much Viagra as you want. Well, I'm not saying take as much Viagra as you want, because it can lead to problems if you take too much of it, right? What I'm saying is that if you take it, it doesn't affect the sexual context in which you're in, right? Because it's not going to change shame or guilt or embarrassment you might have about your fantasies. It's not going to make it easier for you to communicate about your desires or to ask your partner about what they want or to tell your partner what you really want. And so it's a Band-Aid solution, right? And so I think, it's great that we have these drugs and that they're so readily available through telehealth and all these other means, but they don't fix the issue that so many people have, which is that we just can't talk about sex. So we need to get more comfortable with that, because just having a functional penis isn't a guarantee of pleasure.
I love that. That was a great way to wrap it up.
Yeah, for sure. So, Justin, tell us about your podcast. Where can our listeners find you? You do such amazing work, and I'm sure they've heard of you already if they haven't. But, obviously he's someone to follow and listen to for sure.
Well, I run the Sex and Psychology podcast. You can listen at sexandpsychology.com or on your favorite podcast platform. I also have a book called Tell Me What You Want that's all about the science of sexual fantasies. It's available wherever books are sold. And you can also follow me on the socials. I'm either at Justin Lehmiller or Justin J. Lehmiller on Instagram, X, and so forth. And if you follow somebody who looks like a 12-year-old boy and it's not me, it's probably because they are a 12-year-old boy, because there is another Justin Lehmiller who beat me to the name really? On certain platforms, right? So
you gotta buy that from him, man. You gotta buy that from him.
Look for the guy with the beard who's talking about sex, right?
Not the 12-year-old talking about sex.
Yes. No, stay away from that. Stay away.
All right. Well, this was really great, Justin. I'm sure we'll have you on, because I mean, we can talk about all this stuff forever, but I want to thank you again for coming on, and thank our listeners as always. Make sure to check out Justin on all where he is, and for us, always listen to us on our podcasting platforms: Spotify, iTunes, Amazon. You can check out our socials at The Man Up Pod, and on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. And for Kevin and Justin, thanks for listening. Until next time, have a good one.